Picture this. It's early morning, somewhere in ancient southern Africa, around 60,000 years ago, and a woman is sitting beside the body of someone she loved. Maybe her mother, maybe a close companion of 30 years, maybe someone who taught her everything she knows about which plants are safe and which ones aren't, someone whose presence shaped the texture of every single day for as long as she can clearly remember. The group is preparing to move on, because moving on is what ancient humans did. The world didn't pause for grief any more than it paused for anything else. And yet she is sitting there, not ready, doing something that serves no immediate survival purpose, touching the person's hand, not leaving, being in the presence of an ending that her brain is apparently not finished processing. Nearby, outside the camp's perimeter, a wolf that has been loosely associated with this group for 2 seasons, eating scraps, maintaining a cautious but established presence, is behaving strangely. Its companion, another wolf that has been present since the beginning of this association, died yesterday from something quick and unclear. The surviving wolf keeps returning to the location where the other died, sniffing it, lying near it, making low sounds that don't match its usual vocal repertoire. It eventually leaves with the group when they move because survival requires it. But for the next several days, it moves differently, eats less, maintains a quieter kind of presence at the edge of the human camp, as if something in its behavioral orientation has shifted and hasn't quite found its new calibration yet. Two different species, two different nervous systems, two apparently similar experiences happening in parallel on the same morning in southern Africa. And the question this video exists to investigate properly is whether what the wolf experienced in those days constitutes grief in any meaningful sense, or whether applying that word to animal behavior is just the kind of comforting projection that humans make onto a world they want to find emotionally familiar. Stick around, because the scientific conversation about animal grief is considerably more serious, more documented, and more philosophically significant than popular accounts usually convey, and the ancient human dimension of this story adds context that changes how we understand both animal behavior and the deep evolutionary roots of one of the most distinctively human emotional experiences. Start with the honest framing problem, because every conversation about animal emotion runs into it, and most conversations never properly acknowledge it. Grief in humans is both a behavioral pattern and a subjective experience, and these two components are worth separating clearly. The behavioral pattern includes reduced appetite, social withdrawal, altered sleep, returning to locations associated with the deceased, and sustained behavioral change following loss. The subjective experience is the felt quality of loss, the particular kind of suffering that accompanies the cognitive recognition that someone who mattered is permanently gone. We can observe behavioral patterns in animals directly. We have been observing them for decades in controlled and naturalistic settings, and the documentation is substantial. The subjective experience component is, as we've discussed in earlier videos on animal consciousness, inaccessible to direct verification in any animal other than ourselves, which means the honest position on animal grief must distinguish between what is documented at the behavioral level and what can only be inferred about the experiential level. With that distinction in place, what the behavioral evidence actually shows is striking enough to take seriously. Elephant behavior following the death of group members is the most extensively documented case in the animal grief literature, and the behaviors involved are specific, consistent, and difficult to explain through purely non-emotional mechanisms. Elephants return to the bones and bodies of deceased group members, sometimes years after the death, spending extended time touching, turning, and examining the remains with their trunks in ways that appear investigative rather than simply olfactory. They respond differently to elephant remains than to the remains of other large animals, suggesting specific recognition rather than general curiosity about bones of any kind. When a group member dies, surviving, elephants show behavioral changes that cluster in recognizable ways: reduced movement, decreased feeding, extended time spent in close proximity to the body, and in some cases, vocalizations that researchers describe as distinct from the sounds elephants make in other contexts. Calves whose mothers have died show prolonged behavioral disruption that goes beyond the immediate practical problem of losing a primary food source, suggesting that the social and attachment dimensions of the loss have effects beyond the nutritional ones. Elephant matriarchs who die represent a specific and well-documented case because the social consequence of their death is so visible and measurable. The group loses not just a member, but the repository of decades of accumulated geographic and social knowledge we've discussed in earlier videos. The behavioral disruption following matriarch loss is substantial, with groups showing disorientation in movement patterns and decision making that suggests something more than simply missing one individual's specific skills. The members of the group are responding to a social absence in ways that affect their collective functioning. The cross-species elephant behavior toward human remains is a detail that appears in multiple accounts from wildlife researchers working in areas where elephants have had significant human contact. Elephants encountering human remains have been observed showing behaviors similar to what they show toward elephant remains, including extended inspection and what appears to be deliberate lingering, a behavior that doesn't fit simple resource exploitation explanations and suggests something about how elephant social cognition processes the remains of beings with whom they had significant prior contact. Chimpanzee behavior following the death of group members has been documented across multiple long-term field sites and shows patterns consistent with the elephant evidence while being distinct in species-specific ways. Perhaps the most striking documented cases involve chimpanzee mothers carrying deceased infants for extended periods, sometimes days or weeks, apparently unable or unwilling to separate from offspring despite the practical difficulties this creates. This behavior has been observed across multiple chimpanzee populations in both wild and sanctuary settings, suggesting it represents a consistent species behavioral response rather than an individual anomaly. The carrying behavior is difficult to explain through any mechanism that doesn't include something like attachment disruption, the behavioral manifestation of a social bond that can't immediately adjust to the permanent absence of its object. Whether this involves subjective suffering in the way human grief involves subjective suffering is beyond what behavioral observation can confirm. But the behavioral pattern maps closely onto what attachment disruption looks like in humans in its early acute phase. Other chimpanzee responses to the death of group members include what field researchers have described as a specific quiet that falls over a group following a death, altered social dynamics, increased affiliative behavior among surviving members, and prolonged attention toward the location where a death occurred. These patterns have been documented enough across different field sites and different research teams to represent a consistent finding rather than the interpretive projection of any single researcher. Corvids, particularly ravens and crows, show behavioral responses to the death of conspecifics that have attracted significant research attention because of the species' well-established cognitive sophistication. Groups of crows gathering around a dead conspecific, sometimes called crow funerals in popular accounts, have been documented enough to have been studied systematically. Researchers have found that these gatherings appear to serve a functional purpose in some cases, with crows apparently assessing information about threats associated with the location where a conspecific died, but the behavior also consistently includes elements that go beyond pure hazard assessment, including prolonged proximity, reduced vocalization, and what observers describe as a distinctive quality of collective attention. Whether this represents grief in any experiential sense or a sophisticated social learning behavior that produces grief-like outcomes through different mechanisms is exactly the kind of question that sits at the current boundary of animal cognition research. Both interpretations are consistent with the observable behavior. The difference lies in what's happening at the level of internal states that produced the behavior, states that behavioral observation can't directly access. Dogs provide the most familiar context for most people encountering this question, and the evidence for grief-like behavioral responses to loss in dogs is extensive, if often anecdotal rather than systematically controlled. Dogs losing long-term human companions or canine companions show behavioral changes, reduced appetite, altered sleep, searching behavior in locations associated with the absent individual, and sustained changes in activity, level, and social engagement that parallel the behavioral markers associated with human grief closely enough that veterinary behavioral research takes these responses seriously as clinically significant phenomena requiring attention and management. The domestication history we've discussed in earlier videos is relevant here because dogs represent the animal species with the longest, deepest history of close social relationship with humans. And this history has shaped dog social attachment systems in ways that make loss of primary attachment figures particularly significant. The social bonds dogs form with human companions appear to be genuine primary attachments that activate the same behavioral systems as within species primary attachments, which means disruption of these bonds through death produces responses that are functionally equivalent to the grief responses dogs show for lost canine companions. Returning to the ancient human context, the parallel we described in our opening scenario, ancient human grief and proto-dog grief happening simultaneously in the same ancient camp following a loss event represents something that was almost certainly a real feature of ancient human life across the many thousands of years of human-dog coevolution. Ancient humans and their proto-dog companions shared not just living space and food resources, but, apparently, a similar basic emotional architecture around social attachment and its disruption through loss. This shared emotional architecture is worth reflecting on because of what it suggests about the evolutionary roots of grief-related behaviors. If both humans and the wolf-like animals that became dogs show attachment disruption behaviors following loss, and if those behaviors share structural similarities despite the very different evolutionary histories of the two lineages, this convergence suggests that the behavioral systems underlying what we call grief have deep evolutionary roots rather than being recent developments specific to human complexity. The broader evolutionary logic of grief is a thread that researchers studying the adaptive functions of bereavement have explored from multiple directions. The question of why natural selection would favor prolonged behavioral disruption following loss, which seems to reduce fitness at least in the short term, has several proposed answers that illuminate what grief might actually be doing functionally. One framework positions grief as the functional consequence of the same attachment systems that produce the social bonding essential for cooperative survival. If strong social bonds are adaptive, the neural systems that generate and maintain them must be capable of generating distress when those bonds are severed, because distress signals that something important to fitness has been lost. Grief, in this view, is what the bond maintenance system does when it loses its object, a residual activation pattern that has nowhere to go and produces behavioral disruption as a consequence. This framework doesn't require grief to be adaptive in itself. The social bonds it reflects are adaptive. The grief is simply what happens when those adaptive bonds are severed in a system that wasn't designed to easily switch them off. This mechanism would produce grief-like behavioral responses in any species with sufficiently strong social bonds and social attachment systems sophisticated enough to maintain specific individual representations of attachment figures, rather than just general social affiliations. Another framework emphasizes the potential adaptive value of the behavioral changes grief produces. Reduced foraging activity and social withdrawal might serve as signals to other group members that an individual has experienced a significant loss and needs social support, triggering the kind of community response to individual distress that we've documented as a feature of ancient human social life across many earlier videos. In this view, grief behaviors function partly as social communication, broadcasting a state that elicits supportive responses from group members who benefit from the social cohesion that mutual support maintains. The social support response to grief in ancient humans was almost certainly a real and significant feature of ancient group life. The same cooperative social infrastructure that ancient humans developed for managing injury, illness, orphaned children, and other forms of individual vulnerability would have extended to grief, with group members providing food, company, and practical assistance to individuals experiencing the behavioral disruption that loss produced. This social support function of grief, grief as a signal that elicits community response, represents an adaptive value that selection could maintain even if the grief state itself was costly to the individual experiencing it. Something worth examining is the specific way that ancient human grief practices, the burial behaviors, and associated material culture that we've documented across various earlier videos might connect to the behavioral management of grief in ways that go beyond simple cultural expression. The careful burial of the dead, the placement of objects with bodies, the evidence of prolonged attention to burial sites, all of these can be understood partly as behavioral responses to the disruption of attachment bonds, activities that provide something for the disrupted attachment system to do. ways of maintaining some form of relationship with the absent individual during the period when the attachment system is trying to process the permanent nature of the loss. This behavioral management function of grief rituals has parallels in documented animal behavior in ways that are worth noting. The prolonged carrying of deceased offspring by chimpanzee mothers, the extended attention to remains that elephants show, the crow gatherings around dead conspecifics. All of these might be understood partly as behavioral activities that the disrupted attachment system generates while attempting to process a loss that the system wasn't designed to easily accept. The behavior continues longer than survival utility would dictate because the system driving it isn't primarily a survival optimization system, but an attachment maintenance system that doesn't switch off cleanly when the attachment object is permanently removed. The marine mammal evidence for grief-like behavior adds a dimension worth including. Dolphins and orcas have been documented supporting deceased group members, sometimes literally buoying up dead bodies at the surface for extended periods in behaviors that appear to exceed what simple investigation would explain and parallel the physical proximity and attentive behaviors that attachment disruption produces across other socially bonded mammals. Orca families that have lost members, particularly calves, show behavioral disruption patterns across the surviving family members that researchers studying these populations long-term describe as consistent and significant. The evidence from across these species doesn't prove that any of them grieve in the full, rich, subjectively experienced way that humans grieve. That proof is and may remain unavailable, given the fundamental limits of accessing another being's subjective experience. What the evidence does demonstrate is that behavioral responses to the loss of socially bonded individuals that share structural characteristics with human grief behaviors are widespread across cognitively sophisticated, socially bonded species, suggesting that the behavioral systems underlying grief are evolutionarily ancient and distributed across a broader range of the animal kingdom than a strictly human exceptionalist view would predict. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The specific cognitive requirements for grief, as opposed to simple social disruption following any significant environmental change, include the capacity for individual-specific social recognition, the formation of attachment bonds that are specific to particular individuals rather than generalized toward social companions generally, the representation of individual identity as something persistent across time so that absence can be distinguished from simple non-presence, and some form of expectation about the continued presence of familiar individuals that is violated by death. These cognitive requirements are demanding enough that they wouldn't be met by all socially living species, but they are met by the cognitively sophisticated species where grief-like behavioral responses are most clearly documented. Ancient humans meeting these cognitive requirements fully and possessing grief that was rich, sustained, and deeply experiential is as well supported by the indirect evidence available as any claim about ancient human inner life can be. The burial practices. The evidence of prolonged care for dying individuals, the presence of personal objects with remains suggesting persistent representation of individual identity even after death. All of these point toward an ancient human relationship with loss that was emotionally substantial and socially significant in ways that left material traces across the archaeological record. That the wolf in our opening scenario was experiencing something in the neighborhood of grief, behaviorally speaking, while the ancient woman beside it was experiencing grief in its full human complexity, represents a continuity of emotional experience across species that tells us something important about how this emotional architecture arose. Grief didn't appear suddenly as a uniquely human invention. It developed gradually across the same evolutionary history that produced social bonding, attachment, and the sophisticated social cognition that makes individual-specific bonds possible. Ancient humans didn't invent grief any more than they invented love, or jealousy, or fear. They inherited the emotional architecture for it from a much longer evolutionary history, and added to it the cognitive complexity, the language, the ritual, the cultural elaboration that makes human grief the specifically human experience it is. The wolf beside the ancient camp was running a simpler version of the same basic program. And recognizing this isn't a reduction of human grief to animal behavior. It's an expansion of our understanding of what emotional life is doing in the world and how far back into evolutionary history its roots actually reach. Do animals also grieve? Based on the behavioral evidence across elephants, chimpanzees, corvids, dogs, marine mammals, and various other socially bonded species with the cognitive architecture required for individual specific attachment, based on the evolutionary logic that positions grief as the behavioral consequence of adaptive social bonding systems, and based on the ancient human context that places human grief within a much longer evolutionary history of social attachment and its disruption. The answer is something real is happening in these animals when they lose a significant social bond. Something that shares enough structural characteristics with human grief to take seriously, even as the full subjective richness of human grief remains beyond what behavioral evidence can confirm in any other species. The woman in ancient Africa sitting beside the person she lost and the wolf at the camp's edge circling the place where its companion died were both, in their own ways, doing something that the long history of social life on this planet apparently makes inevitable when bonds this strong meet endings this final. The details differ enormously. The basic shape of the experience may not,